One of the areas it appears to be, again from the outside looking in, unaffected by the recession are the revenues coming into Formula One from television and some of the other rights that the Formula One economy holds. Do you see that continuing to remain strong? And I say that in the context of what we see happening in the UK with the BBC and Sky and having to split the rights there. How long can the rights numbers be as high as they are?
Well, I think the potential, the appetite of various media outlets now for sport, live sport, for technology, for data is enormous, and it's greater than it's ever been. So if you just stand back a long way from it, I think the potential to continue to grow is enormous. However, I think what we have to accept is the model by which we maximize that value will probably have to change, and is changing anyway, whether we like it or not. So there has been a lot of discussion about BBC, Sky in the UK. And the natural traditionalist and a lot of our fan base are understandably concerned and upset that there is a progressive move from free-to-air view of and availability of Grand Prix to various paying formats. Now, I can understand the distress of the fans and the feelings that arise from that. In fairness to Bernie on this one, he didn't go for gold by chasing Sky. The fact is that whole process was started by the BBC. The BBC have priorities on and pressures on their budget. They've decided how much they're going to invest in sport. They've decided where they want to invest in sport, and frankly, they had a contract that they wanted out of. Now, if you're in that situation, Bernie potentially, I guess, could have said to the BBC, well, I'm sorry, your priorities have changed. I've got a contract, I'll hold you to it. Well, in the short term, you're okay, but inevitably, you arrive at a point where as soon as they can legitimately exit, terminate, they will. So I think Bernie, he really didn't have much choice, and I think he's created perhaps the best compromise where the BBC are going to show it. They're going to show half the races live. But that's just, an example. But I think pulling back, if you look at now the younger generation, they don't just watch a television. They have a 2 or 3 screen experience. They'll have it might be in front of a television, but they'll have an iPod in their hand. They'll have a MacBook in their hand. They'll have a smartphone which has a relatively large screen by comparison to the phones we were carrying around 5-10 years ago. And they will be simultaneously looking at all that information. They want to be immersed in the sort of virtual world. And I think if you compare us to tennis or soccer or other sports, we're data rich. We're absolutely the ideal sport. We have a technology alignment. We have masses of data, performance data, really interesting data on strategy and where the cars are. And all that information is available to us. So, as a data-rich, technology-led sport, we are ideal to broaden, and effectively we've got to realise revenues from people who want to watch or receive special information on their phone, on their iPad, on their computer, on television, and we've got to have a much richer, much more complex strategy for how we do that. So I think the opportunity is there. There's an opportunity to get it wrong as well, obviously, and to fail, but I think hopefully we can steer collectively through the various challenges and find a way where we transition from the traditional terrestrial TV feed only to a whole raft of media outlet that's available to the sport.
There's a number bandied around, 600 million television viewers globally of Formula One. If we take just the model of what's potentially going to happen in the United Kingdom, if you look at Sky's viewership of a Premier League soccer match, it's 1 million if it's a top match. So I guess we're thinking that the Formula One total numbers of viewers may drop in the UK as a result of this, and that could happen elsewhere. And my question is, if that does happen, how big a problem is that, given the other revenue sources that you are building up anyway, applied technology and everything else? How important is that 600 million number?
Well, to Formula One, it's been traditionally an important number because a big fundamental part of the business model of Formula One teams was to sell media exposure, brand exposure. So if you follow your logic, then there's a significant threat to the sport, and your logic may ultimately prove to be correct. However, I think we've the way in which brand exposure opportunity of Formula One was measured were effectively bums in seats watching televisions, but the world, as I say, the world has changed. People, or the younger generation, aren't prepared to just sit there, turn the television channel on, scan through 2 or 3 channels and see what's available. There's a sport, there's a Grand Prix, let's watch it. So I think increasingly, people on the move, on their phones, on their iPads, on their tablets, on their laptops, expect to have all sorts of data and information available. And I think it's for Formula One now to spread itself around on all this, new media, whatever you want to call it. I know some people don't like that phrase, but we would have spread ourselves around, and then the exposure and the interest generated will be, it should be larger than it has traditionally been. But the question is, you've got to transition from that traditional model, which was selling terrestrial TV feeds in each of the major markets, to a much more dynamic, complex, more challenging model.
Just as Formula One has to make the change, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of promotion in the new frontier countries. Of course, the one underlying philosophy that's governed the traditional approach of Formula One over the last 30 years is less is more. And it has worked for Formula One, but maybe you're suggesting now that it's time that...
No, I think
revisit
you can't be aim to be the third largest sporting spectacle in the world and say less is more. So that's those are at the moment, as a sporting event and spectacle, we have the third largest viewership now. We're very proud of that, but those are old-fashioned measures now. We've got, and it just won't be the number of people who sit in front of TV screens as how you measure the public interest and the public consumption of your sport. The consumption of the sport will be through all these other media. So it'll be, as most things, life, the world, media, much more complex than they were 10 years ago. So, Formula One has to be more complex to deal with that, inevitably, and we've got to adapt. But I do go all the way back. I feel that we in Formula One, and I've blamed myself. I've been in Formula One for over 20 years in a relatively senior position. So I'm not trying to single out anyone when I say I think Formula One could have done a better job in the last 20 years of managing itself.